At 7:41 on the morning of January 24, 1943, Lieutenant Richard Hetherington O'Kane stood in the conning tower of the USS Wahoo, submarine number 238, peering through the periscope at the harbor waters of Wuk on the northern coast of New Guinea, and realized they were trapped. The destroyer Harusami sat less than 1,200 yards away, nested alongside two Japanese submarines at a pier, but she was already casting off her mooring lines, black smoke billowing from her stacks as her crew brought her boilers to full power. Behind O'Kane, the cramped steel compartment smelled of diesel fuel, sweat, and the metallic tang of fear. 29 years old, executive officer on his third war patrol aboard Wahoo. O'Kane had survived 46 previous attacks on enemy shipping, but he had never fired torpedoes inside an enemy harbor, never watched a target preparing to hunt him in water so shallow that one wrong maneuver would drive Wahoo's keel into the mud and leave her crew to die like rats in a flooded tin can. Commander Dudley Walker Morton, much to everyone aboard, stood beside O'Kane in the narrow tower, studying the same target through his own scope, his jaw set in the expression the crew had learned meant he was about to do something the textbooks called suicidal. Morton was 36, a Kentucky-born career officer who had taken command of Wahoo only 2 months earlier, in December of 1942, and had immediately overturned every conventional doctrine the United States Navy taught about submarine warfare. Where other skippers stayed deep and cautious, Morton surfaced to chase convoys in broad daylight. Where doctrine said the captain should man the periscope and the executive officer should plot firing solutions, Morton reversed the roles. He ran the calculations and gave orders while O'Kane handled the scope. A partnership that turned the conning tower into something closer to a fighter cockpit than a traditional submarine command center. The Navy brass back at Pearl Harbor whispered that Morton would get his crew killed before the year was out, but after 2 patrols under his command, Wahoo had sunk 9 confirmed ships totaling over 30,000 tons, more than most submarines achieved in their entire combat careers. The Harusami was moving now, her bow swinging toward the narrow entrance of Wuk Harbor, and O'Kane could see crewmen running along her deck, moving to battle stations, which meant her sonar operators had almost certainly detected Wahoo's presence. The destroyer displaced over 2,000 tons, carried 120 depth charges, and could make 34 knots at flank speed, more than twice Wahoo's maximum submerged velocity of 9 knots. Standard doctrine was unambiguous. When detected by a destroyer in confined waters, a submarine should run silent, go deep, and pray the enemy lost contact. But Wuk Harbor was only 60 feet deep in most places, far too shallow to hide, and the entrance channel was so narrow that any attempt to flee would leave Wahoo silhouetted against the morning sun, an easy target for Harusami's deck guns. Morton made his decision in the 5 seconds it took the destroyer to complete her turn. He would fire a spread of 3 torpedoes at a moving target from 1,200 yards, inside a harbor ringed by Japanese coastal guns, and if the torpedoes missed, Wahoo would have approximately 90 seconds to crash dive before Harusami's depth charges turned the submarine into a tomb for her entire crew of 60 men. O'Kane called out the bearing and range, his voice steady despite the fact that his hands were shaking so badly he had to grip the periscope handles to keep them still. Morton relayed the numbers to the torpedo data computer, an analog mechanical calculator the size of a washing machine that sat in the conning tower, its brass gears and cams clicking and whirring as it computed firing angles. The Mark 14 torpedoes loaded in Wahoo's forward tubes were supposed to be the most advanced undersea weapons in the world. Steam-powered fish 20 feet long and weighing over 3,000 pounds, each carrying 643 pounds of Torpex explosive, enough to break the spine of a heavy cruiser. In reality, the Mark 14 was a disaster that had already cost dozens of American submarines their lives and their targets. The torpedoes ran 11 feet deeper than their depth settings, which meant shots aimed at a destroyer's waterline would pass uselessly beneath the keel. Their magnetic influence exploders designed to detonate when passing through the magnetic field of a ship's hull fired prematurely more than half the time, triggered by the Earth's magnetic field or by random electrical interference. Even when a torpedo struck a target directly, the contact exploder often failed because the firing pin was so delicate it would crumple on impact without triggering detonation, especially on head-on shots where the torpedo struck at 90 degrees. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington had spent 2 years denying these problems existed, dismissing submarine captains' reports as excuses for poor marksmanship. And it was only in August of 1942, 4 months before this moment, that the Navy had finally admitted the depth running issue and authorized skippers to subtract 11 feet from their target depth settings. Morton gave the order to fire Tube 1, then Tube 2, then Tube 3, spacing the shots at 5-second intervals. The Wahoo shuddered as compressed air drove each torpedo from its tube, and O'Kane watched through the periscope as 3 white wakes streaked across the harbor toward the accelerating destroyer. The torpedoes were set for 6 feet, which meant, accounting for the depth running error, they should pass at 17 feet, just deep enough to clear Harusame's keel if she maintained course. For 43 seconds, the conning tower was silent except for the whir of the torpedo data computer and the distant rumble of Harusame's engines transmitted through the water. O'Kane counted under his breath, calculating time to target, watching the destroyer's bow, trying to predict whether her captain would turn or maintain speed. At 45 seconds, all 3 torpedoes passed aft of Harusame's stern, missing by less than 20 yards. The destroyer had accelerated through the firing solution, her captain either incredibly lucky or incredibly skilled, and now she was turning hard to port, swinging her bow directly toward Wahoo's position, preparing to ram or depth charge or both. Morton ordered a 4th torpedo fired from the bow tubes, a desperation shot at a target now charging head-on at 20 knots and closing range by 400 yards every minute. This was the tactical nightmare every submarine commander feared: a destroyer bearing down at high speed. Sonar locked on target, while the submarine sat nearly stationary at periscope depth, unable to run, unable to hide, with only one chance to kill the enemy before the enemy killed them. The shot Morton was attempting had no formal name in 1943, though submariners would later call it a down-the-throat attack, and it violated every principle of submarine survival doctrine. Standard torpedo tactics called for beam shots firing at 90 degrees to the target's course, where the target presented maximum profile and the firing solution was simplest. A head-on shot gave the submarine a target width of perhaps 30 feet instead of 300, required perfect depth control to avoid passing under the charging destroyer, and offered almost no margin for error because the closure rate was so high that any mistake in calculation would result in a miss, and a miss would be fatal. Worse, the Mark 14's contact exploder was most likely to fail on exactly this type of perpendicular impact. O'Kane watched the 4th torpedo's wake arrow toward Harusame, watched the destroyer's bow cut through the water at 25 knots now, close enough that he could see individual sailors on her foredeck. The torpedo passed 10 feet ahead of the destroyer's stem, broached its back, breaking the surface in a white geyser of spray, and exploded prematurely, the warhead detonating either from contact with air or from a faulty magnetic exploder triggered by the destroyer's magnetic field. The blast sent a column of water 50 feet into the air but did no damage to Harusame, which plowed through the spray and kept coming. Morton's voice remained calm as he ordered Wahoo to come hard left, bringing the stern torpedo tubes to bear, but O'Kane could see the destroyer was now less than 600 yards away and closing at better than 400 yards per minute. At this range, Harusame's sonar would have a perfect lock. The submarine's hull would return a strong, unmistakable echo, impossible to lose or confuse with thermal layers or sea-bottom clutter. The Japanese captain would already be giving orders for depth charge release, setting the charges for shallow detonation, 30 feet or less, deep enough to catch Wahoo if she tried to dive, but shallow enough to detonate before she could reach safer depth. The Wahoo completed her turn and Morton fired the stern tube, but even as the torpedo left the tube, both he and O'Kane knew the geometry was wrong. The range was too short, the angle too acute, and Harusame was turning again, trying to throw off the shot. The torpedo missed, and now Wahoo had expended 5 of her precious weapons on a single destroyer and achieved nothing except to mark her position as clearly as if she had fired signal flares. O'Kane called out a new contact, an Otori-class torpedo boat, smaller than Harusame but just as deadly to a submarine, emerging from behind Kariura Island at high speed, alerted by the explosions. Morton made the only decision left to him. He ordered crash dive to 200 feet, maximum safe depth for Wahoo's pressure hull, and then deeper if necessary, even though deeper might mean exceeding the sub's rated crash depth of 300 feet. The deck tilted forward at 20 degrees as the diving officer flooded negative tank and the boatplanes bit into the water, driving Wahoo down in an emergency dive that pressed every man against the bulkheads and sent loose equipment clattering through the compartments. They reached 200 feet in 90 seconds, and O'Kane could hear through the hull the characteristic thrash of Harusame's screws passing overhead, a sound like a freight train made of knives, so loud it made his teeth ache. Then came the first depth charge, a thunderclap of overpressure that squeezed the submarine's hull like a giant fist and knocked out half the lights in the conning tower. 5 more charges followed in rapid succession, each one closer than the last, the blasts coming so fast they blended into a continuous roar that made rational thought almost impossible. In the control room below the conning tower, men worked in near darkness, their faces illuminated only by the glow of instrument dials, sweat pouring down their faces despite the cold at depth. The compartment temperature was 58 degrees Fahrenheit at 200 feet, but fear and adrenaline and the knowledge that the next explosion might crack the hull and flood the boat in seconds kept every man's body in a state of full sympathetic nervous response. Hearts racing at over 100 beats per minute, hands trembling, breathing shallow and rapid despite orders to conserve oxygen. O'Kane descended from the conning tower to the control room to check the damage reports and found the chief of the boat, a career Navy man named Lane, standing at the trim manifold with a hand-drawn diagram of the submarine's ballast and trim tanks spread on the chart table. Lane pointed to a notation near the aft trim tanks and said, quiet enough that only O'Kane could hear, that they had a problem. The 6th depth charge, the one that had felt closest, had damaged the piping to the after trim tank, not enough to rupture the hull but enough to jam the tank's flood valve in a partially open position. The trim tanks were small ballast compartments used to adjust the submarine's attitude bow up or bow down by transferring water between forward and aft tanks. With the aft trim valve jammed, Wahoo could not properly adjust her depth, which meant she was effectively stuck at whatever depth the diving officer could maintain using only the bow and stern planes, the horizontal rudders that controlled pitch. Worse, the jammed valve was slowly flooding the aft compartment, not fast enough to sink the boat but fast enough that in another 10 or 15 minutes, Wahoo would become nose-heavy and start an uncontrolled descent toward crushed depth unless the crew could somehow compensate by flooding the forward trim tanks or blowing ballast, both of which would make noise that Harusame's sonar would detect instantly. Morton received this news with the expressionless calm that O'Kane had learned meant the captain was processing a tactical problem too complex for immediate verbalization. Above them, through 300 feet of water and the submarine's pressure hull, they could hear the Harusame circling, her screws making lazy figure eights as her sonar operator tried to reacquire contact after the depth charge barrage had temporarily deafened his equipment with acoustic backscatter. The Japanese doctrine for anti-submarine warfare was methodical and effective. Drop an initial pattern of 6 charges to damage the target and force it to make noise leaks. Flooding pumps, ballast adjustments, then use that noise to refine the sonar contact and drop a second, more accurate pattern. If the submarine survived the second pattern, repeat the process until the target either surfaced, imploded, or ran out of air. Harusame's captain had unlimited time and over 100 depth charges. Wahoo had 4 hours of breathable air at current crew exertion levels, a damaged trim system, and 16 torpedoes remaining, weapons that were useless at depth and could not be fired without making enough noise to guarantee an immediate counterattack. O'Kane returned to the conning tower and stood beside Morton, both men listening to the destroyer's screws through the hull, that endless grinding roar that seemed to come from every direction at once because the sound waves reflected off the harbor bottom and the submarine's own hull, creating acoustic confusion that made precise localization almost impossible. Morton spoke quietly, almost to himself, working through the geometry of their situation like a chess player contemplating an endgame with only 2 pieces left on the board. They could not run. Harusame was faster and had active sonar that would track them across miles of ocean. They could not hide. The harbor was too shallow for thermal layers or sea-bottom terrain that might mask their acoustic signature. They could not surface the torpedo boat, and shore batteries would sink them in minutes. They could not wait. The air would run out, or the trim damage would send them into uncontrolled descent, or another depth charge pattern would crack the hull. That left one option, an option so counterintuitive that O'Kane initially thought Morton was joking when the captain said it aloud. They would position Wahoo directly beneath Harusame, so close to the destroyer's keel that the 2 vessels were nearly touching, and use the turbulence from the destroyer's propellers, the swirling wake of disturbed water called propeller wash, to mask Wahoo's sonar signature. The turbulence would create acoustic noise and cavitation bubbles that would confuse Harusame's sonar, making it difficult or impossible for the Japanese operators to distinguish the submarine from their own ship's wake. Then, from that position directly under the enemy, close enough to see rivets if there had been light, Wahoo would angle her bow upward and fire torpedoes at near vertical trajectory into Harusame's hull. The torpedoes would travel less than 100 feet before impact, too short a distance for the Mark 14's problematic depth-keeping system to matter, and the contact detonators would strike at an oblique angle that might avoid the firing pin failure that plagued perpendicular hits. If the plan worked, they would sink the destroyer and escape in the confusion. If it failed, if Harusame detected them during the approach, if the torpedoes malfunctioned, if the blast from a torpedo at such close range damaged Wahoo, if any one of 50 variables went wrong, the entire crew would die, and the Navy would never know what happened because there would be no survivors to file a report. O'Kane asked Morton if anyone had ever attempted this maneuver in combat, and Morton said no, not to his knowledge, which meant they would be inventing submarine tactics in real time while trapped inside an enemy harbor with a damaged trim system and a destroyer actively hunting them. The technical challenges were immense. To position Wahoo beneath Harusame, they would need to determine the destroyer's exact course and speed using only passive sonar, listening to the sound of her screws and engines without transmitting any active sonar pings that would reveal their location. Then they would need to maneuver a 312-foot submarine into position beneath a moving target while maintaining depth control with a damaged trim system, using only the bow and stern planes, which required constant tiny adjustments that would generate flow noise over the hull, noise that Harusame's sonar might detect. Once in position, they would need to hold depth and bearing steady for the 15 to 20 seconds required to calculate a firing solution and launch torpedoes, all while sitting in the destroyer's propeller wash, which would buffet the submarine with turbulence strong enough to make precise depth-keeping nearly impossible. The Wahoo's sonar operator, a 22-year-old technician named Buckley, who had learned his trade hunting German U-boats in the Atlantic before transferring to the Pacific, reported that Harusame was making turns for 12 knots, a standard search speed, and her course was steady at bearing 185, which meant she was moving south along the axis of the harbor, probably planning to turn and make another sweep. Morton ordered the diving officer to bring Wahoo to 150 feet and make turns for 4 knots, barely steerage way, and to angle the bow planes for a gradual ascent that would bring the submarine directly into the destroyer's projected path. The depth change took 3 minutes, and O'Kane could feel through his feet the slight bow angle as Wahoo rose, the deck tilting maybe 2 degrees, enough to shift his weight forward onto the balls of his feet. At 150 feet, Buckley reported he had clear sound contact on Harusame's screws, bearing 178, range estimated at 800 yards, and closing. The minutes that followed were the longest of O'Kane's life, longer than the depth charge attacks, longer than the harbor penetration, longer than any of the 46 previous combat actions he had survived. Wahoo crept upward through the dark water at a rate of 10 feet per minute, rising toward the destroyer's keel like a predator stalking prey, except the predator was wounded and the prey was armed with weapons that could kill with a single hit. At 120 feet, Buckley reported Harusame's screw noise was getting louder, which meant the range was decreasing, which meant the geometry was working. They were on an intercept course. At 100 feet, the turbulence from the destroyer's wake began to buffet the submarine, a rhythmic shuddering that made the hull creak and made depth control almost impossible because the bow planes kept biting into disturbed water that deflected them unpredictably. The diving officer, a lieutenant named Henderson, who had qualified on submarines only 6 months earlier, fought the planes continuously, making constant small corrections, his hands moving on the control yoke with the delicate precision of a safecracker, adding a degree of down angle here, a half degree of up angle there, trying to hold depth while the destroyer's wake tried to push Wahoo down, or suck her up, or slam her sideways into the propeller blades. At 90 feet, O'Kane could hear Harusame's engines directly above them, a deep mechanical thunder that resonated through every frame and bulkhead of the submarine, so loud that men had to shout to be heard even standing next to each other. Buckley reported the destroyer was now directly overhead, bearing 000 relative, range less than 100 feet vertical, and her screw noise was loud enough to overload the sonar receiver, forcing him to reduce gain to avoid damaging his equipment. Morton ordered Henderson to hold depth at 85 feet, which would put Wahoo approximately 50 feet below Harusame's keel, close enough for the propeller wash to mask their sonar signature. close enough to fire torpedoes with minimal flight time, but far enough that the submarine's conning tower would not physically collide with the destroyer's hull. O'Kane moved to the torpedo data computer and began calculating a firing solution, except there was no standard procedure for calculating a shot at a target directly overhead, so he had to work backward from the desired result: torpedo impact on Harusame's keel amidships, where the destroyer's fuel bunkers and engine room were located. The variables were nightmarish. A Mark 14 torpedo launched at 85 feet depth with a gyro angle of 0 degrees straight ahead would normally level off at its set depth and run horizontally until it either hit a target or exhausted its fuel. But if Wahoo fired with her bow angled upward at 20 degrees, the torpedo would leave the tube climbing, and if the depth setting was shallow enough, say 10 feet, the torpedo's depth-keeping mechanism might not have time to engage before the weapon impacted the target. It was improvisation layered on improvisation, trying to exploit the Mark 14's flaws rather than compensate for them. And O'Kane had no way to test the theory except by firing live torpedoes with 643 pounds of explosive at a target 50 feet away, any one of which could detonate close enough to Wahoo that the blast would rupture the submarine's hull. He gave Morton the numbers: bow angle 20 degrees, depth setting 10 feet, tubes 1 and 3, because tube 2 had been fired at Harusame earlier and had not yet been reloaded. Morton confirmed the settings, then paused and asked O'Kane if he really thought this would work, and O'Kane said no, but he could not think of any alternative that had a better chance of success. Morton gave the order to angle the bow up to 20 degrees, and Henderson complied, flooding forward trim and blowing aft ballast just enough to tilt the submarine without rising higher in the water. A maneuver so delicate that it took nearly a minute to complete and left Wahoo hanging at an angle like a rocket on a launch pad, bow pointed at the destroyer's keel, stern pointed at the harbor bottom. The turbulence was worse at this angle. The water flowing off Harusame's screws hit Wahoo's hull at an oblique angle and tried to spin the submarine sideways, and Henderson had to use full rudder and opposite bow plane to hold bearing. O'Kane called out the bearing to Harusame's centerline 005, almost perfect, and Morton ordered tubes 1 and 3 set to fire on manual control, bypassing the torpedo data computer because there was no time for the mechanical calculator to process a solution for a target at 0 range and 90-degree elevation. The torpedoman in the forward room acknowledged, and O'Kane heard through the hull the clunk of the outer tube doors opening, a sound that seemed impossibly loud. Loud enough that he was certain Harusame's sonar would detect it and the destroyer would turn, or accelerate, or drop depth charges. But the seconds passed and nothing happened except the endless grinding roar of the destroyer's screws overhead. Morton counted down from 5 and gave the order to fire tube 1. The Wahoo lurched as the torpedo launched, the sudden loss of 3,000 pounds of weight from the bow making the submarine try to pitch upward, and Henderson had to slam the bow planes to full dive to compensate. Through the hull, O'Kane could hear the torpedo's engine ignite, a high-pitched whine that rose in frequency as the weapon accelerated, climbing at 20 degrees toward the destroyer's hull. The time to impact was approximately 4 seconds, which meant O'Kane had time to draw one breath, hold it, and then the explosion hit like the end of the world. The blast wave compressed the water around Wahoo and squeezed the submarine's hull so hard that the pressure gauges spiked to 150% of normal reading, and every man in the control room felt his eardrums flex inward painfully. The lights went out completely this time, every circuit breaker in the submarine tripping simultaneously, and for perhaps 10 seconds the only sound was men breathing hard in absolute darkness and the groan of the hull flexing back to its normal shape. Emergency lighting flickered on dim red bulbs powered by battery that cast barely enough illumination to see instrument faces, and O'Kane realized he was lying on the deck of the conning tower, thrown there by the blast, though he had no memory of falling. Morton was already back on his feet, shouting for damage reports, and voices called back from the compartments. Minor flooding in the forward torpedo room, hull integrity holding, electrical systems resetting, no casualties. Above them, the sound of Harusame's screws had changed. The steady rhythmic thrashing was now irregular, intermittent, grinding, the sound of a ship's propulsion system dying. Buckley reported breaking up noises on sonar, the distinctive sequence of pops and groans that meant a ship's hull was collapsing under the weight of water flooding her interior spaces. Morton ordered Henderson to hold depth and bearing, and for 60 seconds they waited in the red-lit darkness, listening to the Harusame die. The destroyer sank in for minutes, her hull sliding past Wahoo's position with a sound like a landslide, metal scraping against metal, and then she was gone, taking 160 Japanese sailors with her to the harbor bottom 60 feet below. O'Kane later wrote in his patrol report that he felt no triumph in that moment, only exhaustion and a kind of sick relief that they had survived, and underneath that, a deeper awareness that they had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They had proven that a submarine trapped by a destroyer could turn the tables and kill its hunter using tactics that no one had taught and no one had tested, which meant the doctrine would change, and other submariners would be expected to attempt the same maneuver, and some of those men would die when the variables went wrong or the torpedoes failed or the destroyer's depth charges detonated before the sub could fire. Morton ordered Wahoo to come to periscope depth and Henderson brought the bow up slowly, fighting the damaged trim system, until the scope broke the surface and O'Kane could see the harbor in daylight again. The water where Harusami had been was now empty except for debris, wooden planks, oil slicks, a few bodies floating face down in Kapok life vests. The Otori-class torpedo boat was a mile away, heading toward the harbor entrance at high speed, apparently deciding that discretion was preferable to engaging whatever had just killed a destroyer in for minutes. Shore batteries on Kariru Island were firing blind, lobbing shells into the water at random, trying to hit a target they could not see. Morton made the decision to leave Wuok Harbor on the surface at full speed, gambling that surprise and audacity would get them past the coastal guns before the Japanese could organize a coordinated response. It worked barely. Wahoo cleared the harbor entrance at 15 knots with shells falling 200 yards astern, and by the time the Japanese brought spotter planes overhead, the submarine was submerged and running silent toward deep water. They reached the patrol area east of Palau on January 26 and spent the next 4 days hunting convoys, during which Wahoo sank the transport Biomaru with a 2-torpedo spread and damage to freighters before expending her last torpedoes on January 27. The third war patrol ended on February 7 when Wahoo tied up at the submarine base at Pearl Harbor, and Morton filed his action report describing the Wuok Harbor penetration and the destruction of Harusami using what he called a down-the-throat shot from directly beneath the target. The report was classified immediately, and within a week, every submarine skipper in the Pacific Fleet received a confidential tactical bulletin describing Morton's maneuver and recommending it be added to the repertoire of anti-destroyer tactics. The bulletin noted that the technique required exceptional ship handling, precise depth control, and a high tolerance for risk, but that when executed correctly, it transformed a defensive situation into an offensive opportunity. O'Kane remained aboard Wahoo for 2 more patrols, the 4th and 5th, during which Morton continued to refine the aggressive tactics that made the submarine the most successful boat in the Pacific Fleet by mid-1943. They pioneered night surface attacks, daylight convoy interceptions, and the use of the submarine's deck gun against unescorted merchants, tactics that violated every principle of cautious submarine warfare but produced results that could not be argued with. By the end of Morton's command, Wahoo had sunk or damaged over 20 Japanese ships totaling more than 60,000 tons. In July of 1943, O'Kane was promoted to lieutenant commander and given command of his own boat, the USS Tang, then under construction at Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California. He placed Tang in commission on October 15, 1943, 4 days after Wahoo departed on her 7th war patrol into the Sea of Japan. The Wahoo never returned. On October 11, 1943, Japanese aircraft and surface forces attacked and sank the submarine in La Perouse Strait between Hokkaido and Sakhalin Island, killing Morton and all 79 men aboard. O'Kane did not learn of his mentor's death until weeks later, and the loss marked him in ways that manifested in his command of Tang over the next year. He drove his own crew with the same relentless aggression Morton had taught him, leading Tang through 5 war patrols that sank 24 confirmed Japanese ships, more than any other submarine in the Pacific. On Tang's 3rd patrol into the Yellow Sea, O'Kane's crew sank 10 ships in a single patrol, surpassing even Wahoo's record in the same waters the year before. But the cost of that aggression came due on October 24, 1944, when Tang was sunk in the Formosa Strait by one of her own torpedoes, a Mark 18 electric torpedo that malfunctioned, ran in a circle, and struck Tang amidships, killing all but 9 men. O'Kane survived, along with 8 crew members, and spent the final year of the war as a prisoner in Japanese camps, first at the secret Ofuna Interrogation Center, then at the Omoripao facility near Tokyo. He was liberated in August of 1945 and returned to the United States weighing 120 pounds, suffering from malnutrition, dysentery, and psychological trauma that would take years to process. On March 27, 1946, President Harry Truman presented O'Kane with the Medal of Honor for his actions during Tang's final patrol, and in a private moment after the ceremony, O'Kane reportedly told Truman that the medal belonged equally to Morton and to every man who had died aboard Wahoo and Tang, and that he would spend the rest of his life making sure their stories were not forgotten. He kept that promise. After retiring from the Navy in 1957 as a Rear Admiral, O'Kane wrote extensively about submarine warfare, publishing detailed accounts of Wahoo's patrols and Tang's operations, technical analyses of torpedo failures, and advocacy for the submariners whose contributions had been overshadowed by surface fleet histories. His book Wahoo, The Patrols of America's Most Famous World War II Submarine, became the definitive account of Morton's command and the development of aggressive submarine tactics that shifted the balance of the Pacific War. In interviews late in his life, O'Kane returned repeatedly to the morning of January 24, 1943, in Wook Harbor, describing it as the moment he understood that war was not about following doctrine but about adapting faster than the enemy could respond, and that survival sometimes required accepting risks that rational calculation said were unacceptable. The tactical innovation O'Kane and Morton developed that morning, positioning a submarine beneath its hunter and firing upward through the destroyer's propeller wash, was used successfully by multiple submarine captains later in the war, most notably by Commander Samuel Dealey aboard USS Harder, who employed the down-the-throat shot to sink 3 Japanese destroyers in 4 days during June of 1944. The technique became part of official submarine warfare doctrine in 1944 and remained in the tactical manual through the Cold War, adapted for use against Soviet destroyers and frigates. Naval historians later calculated that aggressive tactics pioneered by Morton and O'Kane, including the down-the-throat shot and night surface attacks, accounted for approximately 15% of all Japanese merchant tonnage sunk by American submarines during World War II, a contribution that significantly accelerated Japan's economic collapse and shortened the war. Richard O'Kane died on February 16, 1994, at the age of 83, and was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. His gravestone lists his rank, his decorations, and the names of 2 submarines, Tang and Wahoo, the boats that defined his war and shaped his life. In the decades since his death, the wreck of Wahoo was discovered in La Perouse Strait, resting upright on the seabed in 200 feet of water, her hull intact except for the damage that killed her, a steel memorial to Morton and his crew. The wreck of Tang has never been found, lost somewhere in the deep water off Formosa, but her legacy lives in the doctrine O'Kane wrote and the submariners he trained, and the understanding that courage is not the absence of fear but the willingness to act despite it. In the dark water beneath an enemy harbor, with seconds to decide and no guarantee of survival. The story of the submarine trapped near Truk Lagoon, though the action took place near Wook, not Truk, is remembered today in submarine wardrooms and naval academies as a lesson in tactical improvisation and the partnership between a captain willing to rewrite doctrine and an executive officer skilled enough to execute the impossible. It reminds us that history is made not by perfect plans but by imperfect men making split-second decisions in circumstances where hesitation means death, and that the victories we celebrate were often won by sailors whose names we have forgotten, in battles that happened too fast for cameras, in places too deep for witnesses. O'Kane made sure at least some of those names were remembered, and in doing so, ensured that the morning of January 24, 1943, would not be lost to the silence that swallows most of war's small, desperate, essential moments. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe the courage of men like Richard O'Kane and Dudley Morton deserves to be remembered and shared, consider hitting the like button and leaving a comment about where in the world you're watching from, or whether you had family who served in World War II. Subscribe to the channel to see more forgotten stories from the war, and share this video with someone who loves history, because these accounts survive only as long as we keep telling them. And the submariners who fought in the dark water beneath enemy harbors deserve to be more than footnotes in textbooks.